Thank you for coming. My name is Reem Bahgat. I'm the cultural counselor of Egypt here at this period, and very happy to host this event. This event is a joint event between the Bureau and the Levantine Heritage Foundation, so we're happy for that. And in fact, it was the suggestion of the Levantine Heritage Foundation that we invite Doris. And as soon as they mentioned Doris, I said, definitely, yes. And I said, if you can convince her to come, I will be very happy.
It was not difficult.
Amazingly, I think it was our luck that Doris said yes, and it was not difficult at this phase or at this time. Okay, let me say a couple of words first about the building, because some people asked me to say that. It is a listed building. It was for a British banker from the 1800s something. And then King Farouk, when he was Prince Farouk, he came here for a year to study, our last king of Egypt. And when he came here, I think he visited this place or stayed in it for a very short period, not for the full period that he was studying. And then after that he moved to another place nearest to the college. And when he became king, during that period, few buildings were bought and few lands in London for Egypt. So for example, the Egyptian embassy and three buildings around it, which is very close to here. And also the land where the mosque, it's also owned by Egypt. And then in 1943, Egypt owned this building to be used for the cultural affairs and for the educational affairs. And since then, it has been used this way. So this is how it is, and it got renovated in 2010, between 2010 and 2012. So my role is simply to try and maintain it and to do the activities that I can offer for our guests. So I hope you'll enjoy the building and the event. Now, before talking about our speaker, maybe the Levantine Heritage Foundation can say a few words quickly, please.
Thank you, Reem. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We're indebted to the Egyptian Cultural Centre for offering us this splendid place. Thank you very much. So just a brief word on the Levantine Heritage Foundation. My name is Quentin Compton-Bishop, I'm the chairman. We're an association that was set up nearly 10 years ago to study the heritage and culture of the many peoples and communities of the Levant region. And we are a mix of families researching their origins, researchers studying Levantine heritage in its various forms, from architecture to music to trade. And we have a very good website where a lot of our records, testimonials from families, research reports are all collected and available free. We welcome members, and we have a little flyer, and if you'd like to join, have a look at the website, see if there's anything of interest, and then please get in touch if you'd like to learn more. I won't say anything more, but anyway, thank you very much again for coming. Thank you.
Maybe we should say also Happy New Year. So this is the first event in this new year, and we are very happy to start it with Doris. I think you all know Doris, and that's why you came. But I will just say a few words, and please welcome Doris with me, because I should say Professor Doris, am I pronouncing right? Behrens-Abouseif. Professor Doris is from 2000 till 2014 was Professor of Islamic Art and Archaeology at SOAS, holding the Nasser al-Khalili Chair at University of London, SOAS. But before joining SOAS in 2000, she was teaching Islamic art at the American University in Cairo, as well as at several universities or universities of Freiburg and Munich in Germany. She has a number of publications, and I think she's actually very well known for her research in Islamic art. You know her better than me, so please welcome Doris with me.
Thank you very much, Karim, for this kind introduction. And it's a privilege and a pleasure for me to be talking here today as guest of the Egyptian Cultural Bureau. And I thank Dr. Karim and the Levantine Heritage Foundation for inviting me. Curiosity for Egypt goes back to antiquity. Her position at the crossroads between the Mediterranean, Africa, and the road to the Indian Ocean have given Egypt significant leverage in international relations already since early history. Although the pharaohs have been the visitors' major attraction since Greco-Roman time, in the late medieval and early Renaissance period, while the Mamluk Sultanate was a major player on the international diplomatic scene, interest for the Islamic capital Cairo awoke and increased in the traveler's perspective. The Mamluk capital was estimated by many travelers as the largest city in the world, and it has been recently described also as a crossroads for embassies. From Cairo, the Mamluk sultans exerted their monopoly over the spice trades between the Far East and the West, and they controlled as well the holy sites of Christianity and Islam. Before the age of discoveries, information about Egypt was gathered mainly by pilgrims to the Holy Land. Pilgrimage was a major occasion of encounter between Europe and the Arab world, and many recent studies have been dedicated to the plethora of European travelers in the Middle East and to the related issues of alterity. Some medieval travelers were more focused on the Bible than others, and some medieval pilgrims were more focused on the Bible than others, and most of them were guided and influenced by the accounts of their predecessors, which they repeated and elaborated upon. Due to the fact that pilgrims shared the same itinerary and same agenda, intertextuality is a major feature of this travel literature and repetition as well. My topic today is focused specifically on the reception of the Islamic city of Cairo and its architecture in these texts. The pilgrims who came to Egypt were guided by the biblical tradition of the Old and the New Testament, which related Egypt to Moses, Joseph, and the Holy Family. Although the sacred geography could not be directly associated with the city of Cairo itself, which is an Islamic foundation, in Cairo's outskirts were the pyramids, which were believed to be the granaries of the patriarch Joseph, and the Garden of Matareya, believed to have sheltered the Holy Family during their flight to Egypt. The Matareya garden was moreover renowned for its plantation of the balsam tree, whose oil was highly cherished in Christian literature. The Matareya balsam was renowned for its superior quality, and its cultivation was a monopoly of the state, who used it as a very precious diplomatic gift to European monarchs. On the way to the Holy Land, pilgrims usually stopped at Mount Sinai, at the monastery of St. Catherine. Visits to the Coptic churches and monasteries in Old Cairo and elsewhere were obligatory on every pilgrim's tour. Guided by the Bible, many pilgrims interpreted not only the pyramids and Matareya, but also some of Cairo's Islamic monuments through the biblical perspective, attributing them to the biblical Joseph. For example, the monumental palace known as the Great Iwan at the Citadel, which was built by the Mamluk Sultan and Prophet Muhammad in the first half of the 14th century, with columns from antique monuments carried from Upper Egypt. This magnificent building was demolished by Muhammad Ali to build his mosque on its site. The Italian traveler Pietro della Valle noted in the 16th century that people in Cairo wanted to associate all important buildings with Joseph or a pharaoh. What he assumed was ignorance was rather intended to suit the pilgrims' needs. Long description of the Nile and reference to its yearly flood are a common feature in traveler accounts, which must have also been inspired by the role of the river in the biblical stories of Moses and Joseph, as well as by the river's significance in Greco-Roman geography. The curiosity for the Nile may also explain the traveler's great interest for hydraulic installation, as I will show. In addition to its Christian reminiscences, Cairo, as a thriving metropolis, stimulated curiosity and fascination in its own right. Moreover, as Egypt continued for a long time to be on the Crusaders' agenda, some pilgrims were keen to gather strategic information on fortifications and military potential. Among them some were clerics or aristocrats with political and diplomatic functions who combined pilgrimage with intelligence gathering. Alexandria was on most itineraries as the first or the last station of the journey. Its classical heritage, Christian associations with St. Marcus, who is also the Saint Patron of Venice, and with St. Catherine, the ancient churches and the fortifications, as well as the harbor's international activities and fortification as well, were repeatedly mentioned in travelogues. It is interesting to know that as early as the 14th century, even pilgrims with outspoken anti-Muslim ideology expressed admiration for Cairo, its grandeur, the density of its monuments, and the wealth of its markets. For example, in 1333, during the reign of Sultan al-Nasser Muhammad, the Irish monk Simon Simeonis expressed his fascination for Egypt's beauty, Cairo's wealth, and the grandeur of its citadel. He gave a rare and valuable description of a hippodrome, probably built by Sultan al-Nasser Muhammad, near the Nile, equipped with a loggia for the ladies of the court to watch the royal tournaments. And he says, as we can see here, in the pavilion in which the wife of the Sultan and other nobles take their places, protected from the pressure of the spectators, and watch the game, and especially the exploits of the Sultan, and so forth. In 1335, a few years later, James of Verona mentioned Cairo cemeteries with their mausoleums, gilded and painted and lavishly decorated with precious marbles he had never seen the likes before. A few decades later, in 1395, the French aristocrat Auger d'Amblure praised in enthusiastic terms Cairo, its citadel, and its numerous mosques and baths. He found the city huge and marvelous and emphasized the beauty and quality of its residential architecture, which he described as the finest he had ever seen. He admired the marble decoration and the multitude of lamps in the mosques, also noting at the same time the absence of images. He referred to the royal monuments in the neighborhood of the citadel and to a great square in this area with the Sultan mosques. This must be the Rumalia Square, which is and the Mosque of Sultan Hassan, in view of the late 18th century, which was at that time only 30 years old when it attracted his attention. In 1421, Gilbert de Lannoy, an aristocrat and diplomat, was interested in the fortifications and the system of Mamluk government. He found Cairo a city of marvels and gave a fair description of its topography, noting that its markets were full of goods from all over the world. He wrote about the Nile and described the Nilometer on the island of Rhoda, its function and its association with the Nile festival. The Nilometer, in fact, occupies a prominent place in travelogues. It is the oldest extant monument of Islamic Egypt. It was built in 861. And it's a monumental scientific instrument built to measure the yearly Nile flood. It consists of a shaft dug in the rock and connected with the river through 3 tunnels that lead the water to be measured inside by a graded column, as you can see on the right image. Unlike all previous devices to measure the flood, which were open to the river, the shaft of this nilometer allowed an accurate reading. Once the level of the flood, which comes in the summer, had reached its optimal level to open the canal of Cairo, the nilometer became the starting point of the greatest of all Egyptian festivals, which lasted several days. These celebrations have been described with detail and enthusiasm by many travelers over the centuries. From the 15th century onward, with the emergence of the maritime power of Venice and the expansion of its trade and diplomatic contacts with the East, travelers' accounts became increasingly informative, covering various aspects of material culture and anthropology, the fauna and flora, and at the same time, landmarks of Cairo became more articulated. It seems that at some unknown point in the early 15th century, Europeans were prohibited from entering mosques, but they were still allowed to visit the citadel, which was the residence of the Sultan, with the palaces of the Sultan, and as well, the royal menagerie, which had a very special attraction for its exotic animals such as giraffes and elephants. All travelers noted the large number of mosques, which they gave in exaggerated figures of 2 digital thousands. They mentioned cemeteries and the traditional chicken hatcheries, which are unique to Egypt and famous since antiquity. These hatcheries are very well known, and I think there's hardly a traveler account which does not mention them, and they were known already in antiquity as something very special to Egypt. They still exist today. I have just put some pictures with plans of they exist today, apparently still in the Fayoum and in Upper Egypt. And so then I've just put some more recent, of course, images of these hatcheries, which have always fascinated travelers and astonished travelers. With the introducing of printing, illustration added to the documentary value of travelers. Understandably, the earliest images of Islamic architecture were not from Cairo, but from the Holy Land. The account of the German cleric and politician Bernhard von Breitenbach in 1483 was the first to be illustrated. The author was accompanied by the artist Erhard Ruwig, who produced a woodcut panorama of Jerusalem and a view of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. His depiction of the Dome of the Rock and the surrounding minarets in Jerusalem is to a great extent accurate. And here we see also the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is fairly well reproduced. Breitenbach did not include an image of Cairo in his book, but his description of the city is interesting. Although he was a cleric with a crusader agenda, he couldn't conceal his admiration for what he saw. He estimated the citadel and Sultan's residence so large that the city of Ulm or half of Nuremberg could fit inside it. And he reckoned that there were in Cairo more fine mosques with high towers than there were ever churches built in Rome. He was delighted by his visit to a hammam, or steam bath, and was impressed by the panorama of Cairo seen from the Muqattam, where he admired the sight of the city and at night particularly with the multitude of lanterns during the month of Ramadan. What he had seen then, and what many travelers, because they couldn't really within the city see as well, from the Muqattam Hill, the panorama they could see, and this is what we see here on images from various times, including also modern, from the Muqattam looking at the old city of Cairo. So this is why when they could see the monument, the profile, and the minarets and all the cityscape. A couple of years later, in 1487, the German nobleman Konrad Grünberg went to pilgrimage, but he didn't include Egypt in his travel. However, he produced a richly illustrated book with images of Islamic monuments in Palestine, which are among the earliest ever. In Ramallah, he depicted a steam bath, and he also wrote about his exciting experience in a bath. You can see here on the left-hand side, no, this is not the steam bath. Yes, we have a picture of an image on the right-hand side, also a little shrine, and you can see under the dome in red imitation of an Arabic inscriptions under the dome. That's here. In the city of Ramallah, he depicted very faithfully a hammam or a bath with all its dome as it is, and he wrote about it that it is a bath, which is quite a fair rendering of what an Islamic hammam looks like. Cairo doesn't figure, as I said, the earliest architectural representation may have come from the Holy Land, from pilgrims who were there, and Cairo doesn't figure at that time yet, but it doesn't even figure in the famous painting in the Louvre, which documents a Venetian embassy in Cairo by Domenico Trevisano at the court of Sultan Al-Huli in the early 16th century. Although the event took place in Cairo, the anonymous painter depicted instead Damascus with the Umayyad mosque, as you can see in the background. Another Venetian Orientalist painting of the 16th century depicted also other Venetian paintings of the 16th century, there are quite a few of these Orientalist paintings then, depicted Syrian rather than Cairoene architecture. For example, Carpaccio, in his painting of St. Stephen preaching, shows minarets of Syrian style, and you can see on the left-hand side also what looks like the dome of the rock. And also in St. George fighting the dragon, you can see the minarets that are depicted there. They're not Cairoene minarets, but most likely, or they resemble more the minarets that are typical of Alexandria, which are different from those of Cairo. It seems that Cairoene monuments were less accessible to European artists than views of the Haram in Jerusalem, or the Great Mosque of Damascus, or even Alexandria. The dense crowd of Cairo streets, also hostility among the population, and the prohibition to enter mosques may have deterred visitors from coming too close to religious sites and taking notes. Only the more visible monument, Mosque of Sultan Hassan, which overlooks an open space can be seen from the Moqattam Hill and the citadel, was specially mentioned as a spectacular monument. Until the 17th century, the description of Cairo did not dwell on specific mosques. For example, Arnold van Harf, who came in 1487 with a very detailed description of Cairo, its life, its government, and so on, and also included various drawings, does not mention specific mosques or specific Islamic monuments. He just speaks of mosques with minarets at 3 stories, having lamps and crescent at their top. But in the 16th century, Cairo became the subject of urban views, or vedute. In 1549, the Venetian Matteo Pagani drew a view of Cairo that soon became very famous and was reproduced and reprinted multiple times all over Europe until the 18th century, and it was recently well documented in detail by Nicholas Warner in a dedicated publication. It was accompanied by a legend compiled in the usual manner of contemporary travelogues. Although it had a thematic character, the urban layout is accurate enough to allow an interpretation of the components and the surrounding of the city. So I have here to turn, you can see the pyramids. The view is taken from the west. You have the pyramids on your right, the Nile, the island of Rhoda, which looks like this almond-shaped thing, and then from there you look to Cairo. And I don't have a pointer here, But there is even the Asbakeya Lake, which is depicted with people swimming in it, to tell you that this is a pond. I have enlarged it here, but it's up there. And on the back, it doesn't really resemble any monument, but it tells you where was what, quite well in sufficient, quite reliably, but it doesn't really depict monuments. It goes, as was the description of the traveler. They give you landmarks at that time, but no real descriptions of individual buildings. Less famous, but not less fascinating, is the view of Cairo, drawn slightly later in 1556 by Pellegrino Brocardi. Brocardi likewise accompanied his view with a description of Alexandria and Cairo, and also a description of a religious festival. His veduta is more lively and realistic than Pagani's. It also shows Cairo from the opposite perspective. Whereas Pagani's view shows the city from the west, Brocardi looked at it from the eastern side, from the Mokata Hill, where he also depicted himself at work. So you see here Brocardi sitting and taking notes or drawings. And then the city is exactly the opposite side. The Asbakeya Lake is on top, the Nile there. The island of Rhoda just on the left. And then everything is exactly in the opposite, from the opposite perspective. But look at yes. He is more detailed, and the images he gives of the monument are more lively, and they resemble, or they try to imitate architecture. It's not as schematic as Pagani's description. We have here cemeteries, we have houses which are articulated, we have domes, and the street network is quite quite accurate. But the other thing is, the very particular interest, this has this view has a very particular interest in that it shows for the first time, it gives us an information about the mosque of Sultan Hassan. You can see here, he is sitting, and in front of him the citadel near the blue arrow, and on the right side of the blue arrow is the mosque of Sultan Hassan, which you see here, a bit enlarged. And he, if you look closely, you will see that he has depicted one minaret larger than the other, which is indeed how the mosque of Sultan Hassan was built. Today it looks like that, but originally it had a different kind of dome, but from the beginning, the two minarets were not equal. There was one larger than the other. And the Brocardi view has another valuable information. It shows the mosque, the dome of the mosque of Sultan Hassan as bulbous. And indeed, we know that the original dome was bulbous. It's not the one we see today, which was in the 18th century. It was, I have made a self-made reconstruction to show how the original dome looked like, because another Italian, Pietro della Valle, had described, he was a noble man, a polymath, very lively, very interesting character, and a very original writer. He also noticed that the dome of Sultan Hassan looked very different from all the other domes of Cairo, and he said it was described like an egg, bulbous, narrow at the end, and tapering at the top. He is the only one who gives that description, and is the only description we have of the mosque of Sultan Hassan before the dome collapsed in the 17th century. So here, this image of Brocardi and Pietro della Valle verbal descriptions are really a very valuable document, and they show us something that we don't, for which we have no other evidence. Anyway, the two maps are quite accurate, that of Brocardi, and that they give the basic features quite faithfully, because we can, especially if we compare them with the map of Cairo later drawn by Napoleon's scholar. Coming back to Pietro della Valle, not only he was able to recognize it, could see that the dome of the Mosque of Sultan Hassan was different from all others, and we know today that probably it was influenced from outside Cairo. It was a different tradition of dome architecture. Not only did he recognize that, but also he could tell that the great Iwan, the palace at the citadel, which I have shown you at the beginning, was not built by in biblical times, but as assumed by almost all other travelers of the time, but that it was an Islamic monument. The account of the Polish-Lithuanian Prince Radziwiłł of his visit to Cairo in 1582, of a pilgrim in a pilgrimage tour, is copious and stands out at that time for the attention it dedicates to Islamic monuments. Radziwiłł, who was accompanied by a big retinue, he was a prince and was well connected in diplomatic and political circles, mentioned by name the mosques, which is the first time we have this, the Mosque of Al-Azhar, the Mosque of Sultan Hassan, the Hospital of Qalawun, and the Mosque of Al-Huri nearby, the Mosque of Al-Mu'ayyad, and the Mosque of Masbadi. So he went, he was all very well guided, and he was educated enough to make notes and give the names of specific monuments that he has come across. At the citadel, however, he attributed the well of Joseph, or the well of Salah ad-Din, and the palace of Al-Nasir Muhammad to the biblical Joseph. Radziwiłł is an important source on medieval Cairo, and I hope it will be translated. The only translation that exists from the Latin is Russian, because of his descriptions of important monuments that no longer exist. His account was very useful for me for my research. For example, he described the hippodrome and some other princely buildings in the northern suburb of Cairo that have disappeared a long time ago. This hippodrome is regularly mentioned in Mamluk sources as a venue for tournaments, parades, and public events, equipped with accommodations for spectators, a kind of stadium. Such reliable description complement the information provided by the Arab chroniclers and our knowledge of medieval Cairo. So it is when you get this kind of information really valuable and can be used for academic documentation. It is interesting to note that among most of the descriptions of Cairo at this period, until this period, the Fatimid walls and the gates of Bab al-Futuh and Bab al-Nasr were not mentioned, not until the 18th century. Because they were no longer the entrance to the city of Cairo that has grown by that time far beyond the Fatimid boundaries, concealing the gates and the northern walls on the later period. From the 18th century onwards, with the European growing interest in geography and history, descriptions of Egypt increased in acumen and illustrations. The journeys then included excursions to the on the Nile to Upper Egypt. Egypt was then a part of the tour in the Ottoman Empire that passed by Istanbul and Anatolia, Syria, and the Holy Land. Although interest for Egypt was always predominantly focused on antiquity, and although Istanbul by that time had superseded the Egyptian capital, a center of Islamic power, Cairo was still a major metropolis, which attracted even increasing attention for its urban traditions and its medieval monuments, which by then had acquired historical and heritage value. De la Valle described Cairo as larger than Rome and Istanbul. Many European visitors to Ottoman Cairo regarded its monuments with nostalgia as vestiges of the great Arab past and deplored the present decay of under what they viewed as decadent Turkish rule. In the 17th century, this is a view also, I'm sorry, I should mention that Radziwiłł described also the intake, the aqueduct that brought water to the citadel of Cairo, which we see here on a modern photograph, on an older photograph, the Maghr al-Uyun. And he also noted, which is very interesting, he noted the wind catcher in residential architecture that no longer exists and which existed in Egypt since pharaonic times, and you can see them here, these openings at an angle above the houses that allowed fresh air, the cool air, to come down and cool the interior of buildings in the summer. So he noticed this, among the things that Radziwiłł has noticed and are worthwhile. Cornelius de Bruyn, a Dutch artist and traveler who visited Egypt on his own account in 1681, is noteworthy in the history of documentation of Egypt. He depicted mainly ancient monuments and published the first view ever of the interior of the Great Pyramid. And at the same time, he was also among the first ever to depict medieval buildings of Egypt. For example, his panorama of the city of Damietta shows really genuine Egyptian architecture and true Egyptian minarets, which are not too stylized. On his way to Cairo, he passed through the northern suburb, which had been previously described by Radziwiłł, and described a small pleasance complex with a palace and a building that has disappeared ever since. And all what we know, what has remained, is a small dome on the right side, which was again transformed by bad restorations and embellishments from outside in the 1960s. But inside it is still a nice, the dome of Yashpak built in the late 15th century. And it belonged to a pleasance complex which was built in the late, found in the late Mamluk period in the late 15th century during the reign of Sultan Qaitbay. De Bruyn was also the first to depict the intake of the great Mamluk aqueduct, the Magra al-Uyun, as we see, leading water from the Nile to the citadel. So you see the modern building on the upper left is De Bruyn's image, and on the right side the same building as depicted by Roberts in the early 19th century. In 1714, the French king Louis XIV, eager to acquire antiquities from Egypt, sent the antiquarian and adventurer Paul Lucas on several tours that led him deep into Upper Egypt. He was not one of the most sophisticated authors, but he gave a very good description of Salah ad-Din's well at the citadel. And he admired the palace of Al-Nasr Muhammad, which we have already seen, while, however, assuming that both were built by the biblical Joseph. Salah ad-Din's well is a technical in the citadel and engineering masterpiece. It was dug 90 meters deep into the rock on the citadel, on the Muqattam hill, to reach the Nile level, down the Nash level, in order to provide water to the citadel without the means of an aqueduct. So it goes 90 meters deep, so you don't need, in time of warfare or siege, you are not dependent on aqueduct. The earliest account on Egypt to provide information on Cairo and its architecture with academic expertise based on knowledge also of Arabic sources was compiled by Benoit de Maillet, the French consul in Egypt between 1692 and 1708, and himself a scientist. Although the pyramid occupied the lion's share in his account, his remarks about the civil and religious architecture of Cairo are the most discerning and perspicacious up to that time. As a consul resident in Cairo, he was able to enter mosques. He referred to their great number, adding that there is none that does not deserve a special mention. He admired the masonry of the Mamluk domes and the carved decoration. He described the hospital of Sultan Qalawun and how it was used at that time, and commercial buildings. De Maillet also provided the first image of the Nilometer interior when it is filled with water. This is the only illustration of an Islamic monument in his book, and I think the earliest image of the Nilometer interior. Slightly later, in 1737 or 38, the Danish captain and explorer Frederick Nobel drew panoramic views of Alexandria and Cairo. And in one of them includes a view of the island of Rhoda, which shows the Nilometer from outside. Most remarkable is his depiction of the Nile festival, celebrating the yearly flood, which is the first of its kind. It is, you can see here, there's a building on the left-hand side of the Nile. This is in the Ottoman period. You have fireworks coming up, and lots of, it's outside Cairo, it's on the southern side of Cairo, not far from the intake of the aqueduct in this area, and you have a little pavilion for the pashas and the Ottoman dignitary to watch the event. So this is the first, and at that time quite unique, depiction of a celebration in Cairo. A decade later, the British clergyman Richard Pocock wrote an important documentation of Egypt. And although he was mainly interested in ancient monuments, he took interest also in Cairo's Islamic building. He published a ground plan and a section of the Nilometer. The intake is and this is the Salah al-Din's well. Yes, I think. He also depicted the intake to make a ground plan of the intake of the aqueduct that brings water up to the citadel. And he made a plan, not quite exact because it was originally had a dome of the great palace of Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad on the citadel. And he also made a ground plan of the Mosque of Amr. So the first time we had a plan, the plan of a mosque ever published. And he made also a review of Bab al-Futuh, which he described as Bab al-Nasr. With that there he made a little mistake with an elevation, no, it's not an elevation, but a view and a ground plan. About the same time, in 1750, the Swedish scientist Hasselquist, who wrote that a European risked his life if he entered the mosque, did, however, take this risk and wrote a general description of mosque architecture. He described how difficult it was, how he risked his life to enter a mosque. He bribed somebody and then he said that all mosques more or less looked alike. And he gives, as you can see here on the text, a description, basic description of what is in general included in a mosque. The marbles, the prayer niche, the mihrab, the columns, the place where the tribune for the sheikh, and also he described as well the minarets, and then he makes an unpleasant and dismissive remark about if the minaret is well built, make the outward appearance of the mosque agreeable, and contributes a little to the beauty of the city, if such a thing is to be found amongst a people who despises architecture and glory more in destroying than in erecting. So this is a very negative, and in fact it is rare. But he had this curiosity. He described Egypt, Hasselquist described Egypt to the point of describing his stay there as a kind of punishment. And another negative report is that prior to Napoleon, very little known, there was an earlier French expedition by Louis XVI in 1778 with the aim of exploring the possibilities of colonizing Egypt. Among its members was a scientist, Sonini, who wrote a panoramic description of Egypt without, however, any illustration of Islamic or contemporary material culture. His descriptions are hostile toward almost all aspects of contemporary Egypt. In Alexandria, he criticized the streets as unpaved, narrow, and awkwardly laid, and commented that the mashrabiyas transformed the houses into prisons. He found nothing there worthy of attention except the vestiges of antiquity, which he was horrified to see scattered across the city with their stones abandoned to be plundered for common use. However, Sonini made an interesting observation on the fortifications of Alexandria, which he found similar to Bab al-Futuh and Bab al-Nasr. And indeed, the fortifications of Alexandria have disappeared in the 19th century under Muhammad Ali, with almost nothing is left. And he did, this is a view, the upper one, made before Muhammad Ali and before the French expedition by Francois Cassaf, about whom I will talk now. And this is the gate of Rome, the gate of Alexandria. And he described the fortification of Alexandria as comparables to those of Fatimid Cairo, or Bab al-Futuh and Bab al-Nas, which was probably accurate. And he cites Pocock, who said that the walls were restored in under the Ayyubis, which also is a good information, which shows some knowledge of the history. And indeed, today we know that the fortification of Alexandria, which may have existed, continued to exist in antiquity, were continuously restored under the Fatimids as well as under the Ayyubis in later period. So here we get really accurate information. In spite of his outspoken dislike of what he saw in Cairo, Sonini described the Mamluk cemeteries as handsome, adding that he had wished but was unable to visit them properly for safety concerns. Hostile reports were rather rare in Egypt travel literature. The British ambassador to Istanbul, Robert Ainsley, published in 1801 a book with the title Images from Egypt. In his introduction he wrote, "From the remotest times with which we are acquainted to the present period, no country has excited so much attention as Egypt, for it had had peculiar claims to our notice. Long before Rome existed, and when the inhabitants of Greece were mere savages, the Egyptians were a numerous and civilized people to whom science was no stranger. From them the Greeks derived the first rudiments of instruction, and to them all the knowledge of the ancients may be traced back as to its cradle." For the illustration of this book, Ainsley and other views in the Ottoman Empire hired Luigi Meyer, a German artist educated in Rome. Meyer's image includes a wide range of subjects: antique sites, urban panoramas of Cairo and Alexandria and other provincial towns, medieval monuments, as well as contemporary subjects such as festivities and genre themes. So here we see views of, and the upper one is a view of Alexandria with the Mosque of Al-Aqtarin at that time. And there's a very similar one in the description of the Egypt as well, so it's quite accurate. The lower one, showing a square in Cairo, is very difficult to identify, and it seems to have been elaborated upon his drawings and sketches later on. There is this grandiose building which I cannot identify, but we already see depictions of architecture. One day perhaps someone will be able to identify this building with such a staircase, really unusual. And then he depicted the gates of Bab al-Nas, quite accurate. As you can see, here is among the first or the earliest depictions of Bab al-Nas, as far as I can tell. And also, he went and painted and drew and made drawings on the countryside. Near Rosetta, he then depicted a small mosque, which we see here. Today it has changed its appearance, but otherwise it is quite also reliable. And very interestingly and rare, these views of mausoleums and little shrines in the countryside. And there still exists this kind of little shrines on the countryside, or when I saw them last time, it was 20 years ago, but you can find them occasionally in the Egyptian province. And he also depicted a major view in a view, and this was the earliest, after Pocock, but depiction of the great Iwan, or the palace of Al-Nas al-Muhammad I was telling you about, and just been so many times mentioned as having been built by Joseph, the biblical Joseph. And most of all, his depiction of the Nilometer is one of the finest of his book, because it is quite a faithful rendering of the inside of the Nilometer, with the dome, the graded column, and here it shows also the moment when it is filled, and judges and people come to read the grading or the level of the flood on the graded column. So it is quite an important, this was quite an important image. The most impressive and accurate pictures of Islamic architecture in Egypt before Napoleon, I think, were those drawn by the French architect and traveler Louis-François Casas. Like Maya, exactly, he was sent by an ambassador to Istanbul to take views of the Ottoman Empire. This time it was the French ambassador, Choiseul Bouffier. Casas visited, among others, Egypt in 1785, preceding Napoleon's expedition by more than a decade. His work was known to Napoleon scholars and it inspired their documentation. Casas drew several panoramas of Alexandria and Cairo, and for example, views of Alexandria, where you can still see traces of the old fortification before they disappeared, and some extraordinary buildings as this one. It was the last before Alexandria lost its features, and he is the one who developed this magnificent gate, the gate of Rosetta, which was the main gate of to Alexandria, or from Alexandria to the rest of Egypt. And the views of the palace. Now, the palace we have seen before, but now is another view from the citadel with the panorama of Cairo. I think these images are fascinating, and among them, for example, some of them mix with a little bit of fantasy. This view of the cemetery of buildings in Cairo. It has taken me it wasn't easy to identify what he meant exactly and to what extent this figure or this illustration is faithful or it was fantasy. The closest I came to is when I took I looked at a photograph by Fleet in the 1860s of a certain area, cemetery, south of the citadel, and I thought that perhaps this was that and what comes closest to what he saw. He may have added some details on his own, but difficult to tell. A view of Bab el-Futuh, and especially I think these drawings are particularly interesting. They are not published. These are views which I got from the museum collection in Cologne, and Qalaoun's facade of the mausoleum of Qalaoun had been in Cairo. Some of you know image drawings, of course, and many of the pencil drawings, and then later on they were turned to engravings and elaborated upon once they were submitted. His depiction of the Mosque of Sultan Hassan reminds more of the views of cathedral in medieval European city. But again, this is now as engraving as it was published. Apart from that, it's really, you can see here studies, detailed documentation, architecture drawings. And I think one of the most fascinating is the one of studies of minarets of Cairo with different variations. He must have been, he obviously did not enter inside the mosque, and he must have been, he was fascinated probably by the variety of the minarets and made these sketches that are absolutely accurate and couldn't be better even by a contemporary artist. One of his very famous images were a wedding procession in the streets of Cairo, as we see here. We don't have many illustrations of procession. We have lots of description of procession and festivities. And I suppose this, after the Danish view of the Festival of the Nile, is perhaps one of the rare documentations at that time, visual documentation of a festival. The description of Egypt and the Napoleon's initiative was the culmination of Egypt's exploration, compiled by 167 scholars of all belonging to the academic elite of France. Although it has been criticized by some for not granting the Islamic heritage sufficient attention, for the first time Islamic Egypt acquired a substantial share in the description in a dedicated section with the title État Moderne. It includes a detailed description of Cairo and a map of the city with a precise street network accompanied by substantial legends with all the street names. religious as well as secular buildings in Cairo and in the provinces were illustrated in plans and in innovations. For example, here we have a bath and in Alexandria, and a complex in the city of Alexandria from the Ottoman period. Here we have the first Sand Mosque of Sultan Hassan is documented, and more than that, with innovation and status. So we really are dealing here with studies of architecture, and not to mention, of course, also the famous palace of Al-Nasir Muhammad. And of course, it has a long chapter dedicated to the Nilotica, and with a section and the detailed documentation. The attention dedicated by Napoleon's expedition to the Islamic heritage of architecture and material culture has been acknowledged and visualized more than half a century later by the Orientalist painter Gérôme. Napoleon, this image is very interesting because here you saw the big one, Napoleon with ancient Egypt, with the Sphinx. But also, I mean, Gérôme must have perceived that Napoleon was not interested only in ancient Egypt. And he depicts Napoleon in the lower picture standing in front of the Mosque of Sultan Hassan with Cairo on the background. So it is a visualization of Napoleon, what the description de l'Égypte did, which was to put on the map the Islamic monuments as well. Although some modern critics say, oh, they didn't give enough attention, but it was already a great deal for that time, especially when you see what was before. Gérôme himself was really the symbol of Orientalist painting, and he has his views of Cairo well known and often reproduced, and he has depicted in many absolutely breathtaking images of 19th century Cairo, more than half a century after Napoleon. Some of the European experts employed by Muhammad Ali following Napoleon's departure, Muhammad Ali's radical reforms gave no consideration to matters of heritage, whether antique or Islamic. Modernization accelerated the damage to the traditional city and its monuments. However, by the same token, European presence and influence during his reign and under his successors, the Khedive, generated a new awareness for Egypt's artistic and architectural heritage. So we have two. The city disappeared, the heritage suffered, but at the same time awareness comes up. Some of the European experts employed by Muhammad Ali to implement his modernization schemes turned their attention to pre-modern Cairo and its Islamic art. For example, the French architect Pascal Coste, hired to work on infrastructure and industrial buildings, went to explore medieval Cairo and compiled an album that was the first ever to be exclusively dedicated to Egypt's Islamic monuments. And here, we have studies of minarets and studies of building of the old city on scale, because he was an architect, views of houses in Cairo that no longer exist. Likewise, the French aristocrat Brice Daven, hired to teach the military academy, authored a book on Islamic art and published in 1877 La Arabe in 3 volumes with 200 plates, which are today, you see them everywhere. And there are studies, they are useful, there are documentation, and they are also nostalgic. Jules Bourgoin, hired by the French government to refurbish their consulate in Alexandria, became the first scholar to study Islamic geometry based on material collected in Egypt. And he authored several books on Egypt's Islamic architecture. These explorers were followed by historians and museum curators, like the British Stanley Lane Poole, whose research on Cairo, its history, architecture, and decorative art pioneered academic research on Islamic art and at the same time initiatives for its preservation. Like no other city, paintings on Cairo were produced on an almost industrial scale everywhere in Europe, celebrating with nostalgia monuments as well as artifacts that were seen to be vanishing. Today, this Orientalist art is celebrated with passion all over the entire world, and as many of you would know, collections everywhere in the Arab world are flourishing. The road to ancient and biblical Egypt led to Islamic Cairo, the Mamluk metropolis that fell under Ottoman rule. But even after it was deprived of its political prestige and brilliance, Cairo's image kept growing in the perspectives of its visitors over the centuries as European curiosity progressed from devotion to exploration and to scholarship. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And now we can open the floor for any questions.
My name is Abdullah Houda. I'm a journalist and editor of Times of Egypt.
I don't, can you just, is it working?
It is. Just,
Yeah.
I hope it's working now.
Yeah, no, it's right.
My name is Abdullah Houda. I'm a journalist and editor of Times of Egypt website.
100%.
Your presentation and talk has been great. Its greatness has raised in my mind two striking observations. The first one is that any records of construction, antiquities, buildings prior to probably the 15th century was recorded in literature or relayed in verbal way. And that makes one feel indebted to European travelers that they provided probably the first pictorial or graphic pictures of what we have, and which the written literature could never express and describe as accurate or bring you to the world. The second observation is that it doesn't appear that there is any record of pre-construction design of any of the old buildings which you mentioned. And that raises a question as to how the architect and the builders could visualize what they are creating without a recorded paper, which can help them do things to measure. They did things to measure.
You mean from the Islamic side or from the European side?
No, from the buildings in Egypt, in history, people until now have theories and hypotheses with regard to how a temple is built or the pyramids were built. Now, I don't know whether in the Middle Ages, the Mamluks and from before, whether there are records of designs, pre-construction designs of building, or they visualized it and went on with the building without a design in hand.
Right. The fact that we don't have any records, this is a completely different question. This is another question of how the Mamluk architects work or the medieval architects work. In ancient Egypt is another story, but we're talking now about the Islamic period. The fact that we have no records, no archive source or no material does not mean that it didn't exist. They may have used preliminary thing, little textile, drawings on bones, just to do the work, and after that they were destroyed. This is possible. Many buildings were, not all buildings required really preceding design. Many things was more and could be done just as the work advanced with preliminary sketches. And this is a completely different story, of course. I mean, how the medieval architects work, we cannot say today. We have no records. We can only look at the buildings and try to read the buildings. And from reading the building, we can guess something, but not everything. But we have no record of materials and of drawing. There must have been something, but perhaps something that was destroyed when the work was finished. You don't need to preserve these things, especially that paper was valuable. Paper was used for books, so you use whatever. People sometimes make sketches on bones, on textile, and after that you destroy it. the work is finished. Or you do several, as you move on with the work, you do several stages. But this is only guessing. We have no information. To put it short, there is no information about how they work.
Any other questions?
Please try to speak also loud so I can...
Make it very close.
Right. Is that fine? Very good. Okay. Great presentation, honestly. I'm not an architect or anything, but I'm actually in IT, which is very different, but I found it very, very interesting. I'm just curious as to why, or I don't know, like your talk is mainly about Islamic architecture in Cairo, which are all very much Arabic and Middle Eastern elements, but you only use, or at least from what I've noticed, European references. So it's European literature or European drawings. Is that because, like, due to the lack of like documentation from from Eastern scholars, or I'm just curious as to why we don't?
Not at all. This is the subject of my talk. My talk was the travelogue. So I cannot talk about other
I'm
things.
sorry, yeah. So I was just really curious.
This is the subject and the title of my lecture. I wanted to see how the architecture is seen from the travelogue and how it develops while Europe evolves and advances, and how with the development of culture in Europe, also the description develop until we come to scholarship. This is my point. I'm not talking about the history of Islamic architecture.
Amazing. And it's just, so it's from the view of European travelers then?
My topic is the travelogue.
Okay.
Title, the lecture. This is what I'm interested in. My interest is the travelogues. And I have taken, because they're written about so many things, and there are thousands and thousands of travelogues, I have chosen particularly the subject of how architecture evolves in the perspective and how they view it and how this changes over time. This was the subject of my talk.
Okay, now it makes sense.
Hello, my name is Jan Moxley. I'm a researcher at the University of Southampton. I'm adding a note to one of Meyer's drawing of the big staircase of the one of my friends in Egypt. She just published the research.
Which staircase?
The staircase of the Sayyida Zainab, one of the Sayyida Zainab mosques.
This one mosque which has this big staircase.
Yeah,
Yes.
actually, there was a sarcophagus in the painting, and this sarcophagus in the British Museum. It's called the Hod al-Marsoud, or the Lovers.
Yes,
fountain.
which has underneath here. This is how the picture is called.
Yeah, a researcher in Egypt, Dr. Radwal, she works at the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, just published her research about this particular place, and especially the mosque. She managed to identify the mosque of being I think it's the Gaudi mosque.
Yeah, it's somewhere in Salah, but it doesn't look like this at all.
Yeah.
I know that this is why I was wondering what it could be. You are right. Thank you. Yes, it is the cenotaph is supposed to be the Hod al-Marsoud.
Yeah.
We know Hod al-Marsoud was under Salah al-Gauli, but we don't have such a staircase and Salah. So this is really, and this is the problem when you use the Orientalist painters also like Casas, who is otherwise very reliable.
Yeah.
Suddenly on the one or the other picture they are less reliable, and then you are lost. Yeah, yes, thank you.
I'm facing the same problem. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? I'm facing the same problem because I'm using the same resources in my studies because I'm studying Nile books.
Yes.
It's the same. They are drawing things differently than what's actually.
Yes. I heard one I gave a talk about Casas, and somebody says, "Oh, I thought Casas was always reliable, but also he does sometimes let his fantasy play a role. It's never, you're never sure."
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Any further questions? Comment? Okay, so Can you please join me to thank again Doris for her talk?